Chapter 2. The foreign merchants who lay in Oslo during the summer and trafficked there came to the town in the spring about Holyrood Day, which is 10 days before the Hallvardsvik fair. To this, folk streamed in from all the parishes between Mjøs and the Swedish marches, so that the town swarmed with people in the first weeks of May. This was the best time to buy from the strangers, before they had sold too many of their wares. Sister Potentia had the care of the marketing for Nunnally, and she had promised Ingeborg and Kristin that they should go with her down to the town the day before the Hallvardsvik. But about midday, some of Sister Potentia's kin came to the convent to see her, and so she could not go that day. Then Ingeborg begged and prayed, till at last she let them go alone, although it was against the rules. An old peasant, who was a commoner of the convent, was sent with them as escort. Hakon was his name. Kristin had been 3 weeks now at Nunnally, and in all that time she had not set foot outside the convent grounds and gardens. She wondered to see how spring-like it was outside. The little woods out in the fields were pale green. The wood anemones grew thick as a carpet round the light-coloured tree stems. White fair weather clouds came sailing up over the islands in the fjord, and the water lay fresh and blue, slightly ruffled here and there by the light flaws of wind. Ingeborg skipped about, plucked bunches of leaves from the trees and smelt them, and peeped round after the folk they met, till Hakon chid her. Were these seemly goings-on for a well-born maid, and in the convent habit too? The maidens were made to walk just behind him, hand in hand, quietly and seemly. But Ingeborg used her eyes and her tongue all the same. Hakon was somewhat deaf. Kristin too was wearing the novice's garb now, an undyed light grey wadmal dress, woolen belt and headband, and a plain dark blue cloak over all, with a hood turned up so that the plaited hair was quite hid. Hakon strode in front with a stout brass-knobbed staff in his hand. He was dressed in a long black gown, had a leaden Agnus Dei hanging on his breast, and an image of St. Christopher in his hat. His white hair and beard were so well brushed that they shone like silver in the sunshine. The upper part of the town, between the Nunsbeck and the Bishop's Palace, was a quiet neighbourhood. There were here neither shops nor taverns. Most of the dwelling places belonged to great folk from the parishes around, and the houses turned dark, windowless timber gables to the street. But on this day, whole crowds of people were roaming about the roads even up here, and the serving folk stood loitering about the courtyard gates, gossiping with the passers-by. When they were come out near the Bishop's Palace, there was a great crush upon the place in front of Hallvard's church and the Olaf cloister. Booths had been set up on the grassy slopes, and there were showmen making trained dogs jump through barrel hoops. But Hakon would not have the maid stand and look at these things, and he would not let Kristin go into the church. He said 'twould be better worth her seeing on the great feast day itself. As they came down over the open space by St. Clement's Church, Hakon took them by the hands, for here was the greatest press of folk coming from the wharves or out from the alleys between the traders' yards. The maidens were bound for the mickle yard, where the shoemakers plied their trade. For Ingeborg had found the clothes Kristin had brought from home very good and sightly, but she said the shoes she had with her from the dale were not fit to wear for best. And when Kristin had seen the shoes from the outland Ingeborg had in her chest, more pairs than one, she felt she could not rest until she too had bought some like them. The mickle yard was one of the largest in Oslo. It stretched from the wharves up to the suitors' alley, with more than 40 houses round 2 great courts. And now they had set up booths with wadmal roofs in the courts as well. Above the roofs of these tents there rose a statue of St. Crispinus. Within the courts was a great throng of folk buying and selling, women running between the kitchens with pots and pails, children getting in the way of folks' feet, horses being led in and out of the stables, and serving men carrying packages to and from the warehouses. From the balconies of the lofts above, where the finest wares were sold, shoemakers and their apprentices shouted to the 2 maids, and dangled small gaily coloured or gold-embroidered shoes before them. But Ingeborg made her way toward the loft where Diedrich, the shoemaker, sat. He was a German, but had a Norse wife, and owned a house in the Mickle-yard. The old man was standing bargaining with an esquire wearing a traveller's coat and a sword at his belt. But Ingeborg went forward unabashed, bowed, and said, "Good sir, will you not suffer us of your courtesy to have speech with Diedrich first? We must be home in our convent by vespers. You, perchance, have no such great haste?" The esquire bowed and stepped aside. Diedrich nudged Ingeborg with his elbow and asked, laughing, whether they danced so much in the convent that she had worn out already all the shoes she had of him the year before. Ingeborg nudged him again and said they were still unworn, thank heaven, but here was this other maid, and she pulled Kristin forward. Then Diedrich and his lad bore forth a box into the balcony, and out of it he brought forth shoes, each pair finer than the last. They had Kristin sit down upon a chest that he might try them on her. There were white shoes, and brown and red, and green and blue, shoes with painted wooden heels, and shoes without heels, shoes with buckles, and shoes with silken laces in them, shoes in leather of 2 or 3 hues. Kristin felt she would have fain had them all, but they cost so dear she was quite dismayed. Not one pair cost less than a cow at home. Her father had given her a purse with a mark of silver in counted money when he left. That was for pocket money, and Kristin had deemed it great riches. But she soon saw that Ingeborg thought it no great store to go a-marketing with. Ingeborg, too, must try on some shoes for the jest of it. That cost no money, said Diedrich, laughing. She did buy 1 pair of leaf-green shoes with red heels. She said she must have them on trust, but then Diedrich knew her and her folks. Kristin thought, indeed, that Diedrich liked this none too well, and that he was vexed too, that the taller squire in the travelling cloak had left the loft. Much time had been taken up with the trying on. So she chose for herself a pair of heelless shoes of thin purple-blue leather, broidered with silver and with rose-red stones. But she liked not the green silk laces in them. Diedrich said he could change these, and took the maids with him into a room at the back of the loft. Here he had coffers full of silk ribbons and small silver buckles. 'Twas against the law, strictly, for shoemakers to trade in these things, and the ribbons, too, were many of them too broad, and the buckles too big for footgear. They felt they had to buy 1 or 2 of the smaller things, and when they had drunk a cup of sweet wine with Diedrich, and he had packed the things they had bought into a wadmal cloth, the hour was grown somewhat late, and Kristin's purse much lighter. When they were come to the Oster Street again, the sunlight was turned golden, and by reason of the traffic in the town, the dust hung over the street in a bright haze. The evening was warm and fair, and folk were coming down from Eikeberg with great armfuls of young green branches, wherewith to deck their houses for the holy day. And now the whim took Ingeborg that they should go out to the Geta Bridge. At fair times there was wont to be so much merry-making in the fields on the farther side of the river, both jugglers and fiddlers. Ingeborg had heard that there was come a whole shipful of outlandish beasts that were being shown in booths down by the waterside. Hakon had had a pot or 2 of German beer at the Mickle-yard, and was now easy and mild of mood. So when the maidens took him by the arm and begged him sweetly, he gave way at last, and the 3 went out towards Eikeberg. Beyond the stream there were but a few small dwelling-places scattered about the green slopes, between the river and the steep hillside. They went past a Minorite monastery, and Kristin's heart sank with shame as she bethought her how she had meant to give most of her silver for the good of Arne's soul. But she had had no mind to speak of it to the priest at Nunnally. She feared to be asked questions. She had thought that she could maybe come out to the barefoot friars and find if by chance Brother Edvin were in the cloister now. She was fain to meet him again, but she knew not, either, what would be the most seemly way to get speech with one of the monks and tell him her desire. And now she had so little money, she knew not whether she could buy a mass. Maybe she must be content to offer a thick wax candle. Of a sudden they heard a fearful yell from countless throats down by the shore. A storm seemed to sweep over the press of human beings down there, and now the whole mass rushed towards them, shrieking and shouting. All seemed wild with terror, and some of the runners-by cried out to Hakon and the maids that the leopards were loose. They set out running back to the bridge, and heard folk shout to one another that a booth had fallen down, and the 2 leopards had broken loose. Some spoke of a serpent, too. The nearer they came to the bridge, the worse became the crush. Just in front of them, a woman dropped a little child out of her arms. Hakon stood astride the little one to shield it. Soon after, they caught sight of him far away with the child in his arms, and then they lost him. At the narrow bridge, the press of people was so great that the maids were pushed right out into a field. They saw folks run down to the river bank. Young men jumped in and swam, but elder folk sprang into boats that lay there, and these were overladen in a trice. Kristin tried to make Ingeborg hear. She cried out to her that they should run up to the Minorite cloister. They could see the grey friars coming out from it, striving to gather in the terrified people. Kristin was not so frightened as the other girl. They saw nothing either of the wild beasts, but Ingeborg had quite lost her wits. And now, when there was a fresh uproar in the throng, and it was driven back by a whole troop of men from the nearest dwellings, who had armed themselves and forced their way back over the bridge, some riding and some running, and Ingeborg was nigh coming under the feet of a horse, she gave a scream and set off running for the woods. Kristin had never thought the girl could have run so fast. It made her think of a hunted pig. She ran after her, so that they too, at least, should not be parted. They were deep in the woods before Kristin could get Ingeborg to stop. They were on a little path which seemed to lead down toward the road to Trelleborg. They stood still for a little to get their breath again. Ingeborg was snivelling and weeping, and said she dared not go back alone through the town and all the way out to the convent. Nor did Kristin deem that this would be well, with the streets in such commotion. She thought they must try and find a house where they may hire a lad to take them home. Ingeborg thought there was a bridle path to Trelleborg farther down by the shore, and along it there lay some houses she knew. So they followed the path downward, away from the town. Fearful and uneasy as they both were, it seemed to them they had gone far, ere at last they came to a farmstead lying off in a field. In the courtyard, there they found a band of men sitting drinking at a board under some ash trees, while a woman came and went, bearing out tankards to them. She looked wonderingly and sourly at the 2 maids in convent habit, and none of the men seemed to have a mind to go with them when Kristin told their need. At last, though, 2 young men stood up and said they would bring the girls to Nunnally if Kristin would give them a silver ducat. She heard by their speech that they were not Norse, but she thought they seemed honest folk enough. 'Twas a shameless sum they asked, she thought, but Ingeborg was beside herself with fright, and she saw not how they could go home alone so late. And so she struck the bargain. No sooner were they come to the forest path than the men drew closer to them and began to talk. Kristin liked this but ill, but she would not show she was afraid. So she answered them quietly, told of the leopards, and asked the men where they were from. She spied about her, too, and made as though she looked each moment to meet the serving men they had had with them. She talked as though there had been a whole band. As they went on, the men spoke less and less, nor did she understand much of their speech. After a while she became aware that they were not going the same way she had come with Ingeborg. The course their path took was not the same. 'Twas more northerly, and she deemed they had already gone much too far. Deep within her there smouldered a fear she dared not let herself think upon. But it strengthened her strangely to have Ingeborg with her, for the girl was so foolish that Kristin knew she must trust in herself alone to find a way out for them both. Under her cloak, she managed by stealth to pull out the cross with the holy relic she had had of her father. She clasped it in her hand, praying fervently in her heart that they might soon meet someone, and in all ways sought to gather all her courage and to make no sign. Just after this she saw that the path came out on a road, and there was a clearing in the forest. The town and the bay lay far below. The men had led them astray, whether wilfully or because they knew not the paths. They were high up on the mountainside and far north of Jeta Bridge, which she could see below. The road they had now met seemed to lead thither. Thereupon she stopped, drew forth her purse, and made to count out 10 silver pennies into her hand. "Now, good fellows," she said, "we need you not any more to guide us, for we know the way from here. We thank you for your pains, and here is the wage we bargained for. God be with you, good friends." The men looked at one another so foolishly that Kristin was near smiling. Then one said, with an ugly grin, that the road down to the bridge was exceeding lonely. 'Twas not wise for them to go alone. "None, surely, are such nithings or such fools that they would seek to stop 2 maids, and they in the convent habit," answered Kristin. "We would fain go on our way alone now." And she held out the money. The man caught her by the wrist, thrust his face close up to hers, and said somewhat of "Kuss and Beutel." Kristin made out he was saying that they might go in peace if she but gave him a kiss and her purse. She remembered Bentine's face close to hers like this, and such a fear came on her for a moment that she grew faint and sick, but she pressed her lips together and called in her heart upon God and the Virgin Mary, and in the same instant she thought she heard hoof-falls on the path from the north. She struck the man in the face with her purse so that he staggered, and then she pushed him in the breast with all her strength, so that he tumbled off the path and down into the wood. The other German gripped her from behind, tore the purse from her hand and her chain from her neck so that it broke. She was near falling, but clutched the man and tried to get the cross from him again. He struggled to get free. The robbers, too, had now heard folk coming. Ingeborg screamed with all her might, and the riders on the path came galloping forward at full speed. They burst out of the thicket, 3 of them, and Ingeborg ran shrieking to meet them as they sprang from their horses. Kristin knew one of them, for the esquire they had met in Diedrich's loft. He drew his sword, seized the German she was struggling with by the back of the neck, and thrashed him with the flat of his blade. His men ran after the other, caught him, and beat him to their heart's content. Kristin leaned against the face of the rock. She was trembling now that all was over, but what she felt most was marvel that her prayer had brought such speedy help. Then she caught sight of Ingeborg, who had thrown back her hood, hung her cape loosely over her shoulders, and was in the act of bringing her heavy shining plaits of hair forward into sight upon her breast. At this sight Kristin burst out a-laughing. Her strength left her, and she had to hold on to a tree to keep her feet, for 'twas as though the marrow of her bones was turned to water, she felt so weak, and so she trembled and laughed and cried. The esquire came forward and laid a hand warily upon her shoulder. "You were more frightened, I see, than you would show," said he, and his voice was kindly and gentle. "But now you must take a hold on yourself. You bore you so bravely while yet there was peril." Kristin could only look up at him and nod. He had fine bright eyes set in a narrow, pale brown face, and coal-black hair clipped somewhat short over the forehead and behind the ears. Ingeborg had her hair in order now. She came and thanked the stranger with many fair words. He stood there still with a hand on Kristin's shoulder while he answered her comrade. "We must take these birds along," said he to his men, who stood holding the 2 Germans. They were from a Rostock ship, they said. "We must have them along with us to the town, that they may be sent to the Black Hole. But first we must take these 2 maids home to the convent. You can find some thongs, I guess, to bind them with." "Mean you the maids, Erland?" asked one of the men. They were young, stout, well-apportioned yeomen, and were in high feather from the tussle. Their master frowned and seemed to answer sharply, but Kristin laid a hand upon his sleeve. "Let them go, dear sir." She shuddered a little. "Loath would we be, in truth, both my sister and I, that this matter should be talked of." The stranger looked down at them. He bit his lip and nodded, as though he understood her. Then he gave each of the captives a blow on the nape with the flat of his sword, which sent them sprawling forwards. "Run for it, then," he said, kicking them, and both scrambled up and took to their heels as fast as they could. Then he turned again to the maidens and asked if they would please to ride. Ingeborg let herself be lifted into Erland's saddle, but it was soon plain that she could not keep her seat. She slid down again at once. He looked at Kristin doubtfully, and she said that she was used to ride on a man's saddle. He took hold of her below the knees and lifted her up. A sweet and happy thrill ran through her to feel how carefully he held her from him, as though afraid to come near. At home, no one ever minded how tight they held her when they helped her onto a horse. She felt marvellously honoured and uplifted. The knight, as Ingeborg called him, though he had but silver spurs, now offered that maiden his hand, and his men sprang to their saddles. Ingeborg would have it that they should ride round the town to the northward, below the Rheinberg and Marterstock, and not through the streets. First she gave as a reason that Sir Erland and his men were fully armed. Were they not? The knight answered gravely that the ban on carrying arms was not over strict at any time, for travellers at least. And now everyone in the town was out on a wild beast hunt. Then she said she was fearful of the leopards. Kristin saw full well that Ingeborg was fain to go by the longest and loneliest road, that she might have the more talk with Erland. "This is the second time this evening that we hinder you, good sir," said she, and Erland answered soberly, "'Tis no matter. I am bound no farther than Gederud tonight, and 'tis light the whole night long." It liked Kristin well that he jested not, nor bantered them, but talked to her as though she were his like, or even more than his like. She thought of Simon. She had not met other young men of courtly breeding, but it was true, this man seemed older than Simon. They rode down into the valley below the Rheinberg hills and up along the beck. The path was narrow, and the young bushes swung wet, heavily scented branches against her. It was a little darker down here, and the air was cool, and the leaves all dewy along the beck path. They went slowly, and the horses' hoofs sounded muffled on the damp, grass-grown path. She rocked gently in the saddle. Behind her she heard Ingeborg's chatter and the stranger's deep, quiet voice. He said little, and answered as if his mind wandered. It sounded almost as if his mood were like her own, she thought. She felt strangely drowsy, yet safe and content, now that all the day's chances were safely over. It was like waking, to come out of the woods onto the green slopes under the Marterstock hills. The sun was gone down, and the town and the bay lay below them in a clear, pale light. Above the acre ridges there was a light yellow strip edging the pale blue sky. In the evening hush, sounds were borne to them from far off, as they came out of the cool depths of the wood. A cartwheel creaked somewhere along a road. Dogs on the farms bayed at each other across the valley, and from the woods behind them birds trilled and sang full-throated now the sun was down. Smoke was in the air from the fires on lands under clearance, and out in the field there was the red flare of a bonfire. Against the great ruddy flame the clearness of the night seemed a kind of darkness. They were riding between the fences of the convent fields when the stranger spoke to her again. He asked her what she thought best, that he should go with her to the gate and ask for speech of the lady grower, so that he might tell her how this thing had come about. But Ingeborg would have it that they should steal in through the church. Then, maybe, they might slip into the convent without anyone knowing they had been away so much too long. It might be her kinsfolk visit had made Sister Potentia forget them. The open place before the west door of the church was empty and still, and it came not into Kristin's thoughts to wonder at this. though there was wont to be much life there of an evening, with folks from the neighbourhood who came to the nuns' church, and from the houses round about, wherein lay servants and commoners dwelt. They said farewell to Erland here. Kristin stood and stroked his horse. It was black and had a comely head and soft eyes. She thought it like Morven, whom she had been wont to ride at home when she was a child. "What is your horse's name, sir?" she asked, as it turned its head from her and snuffled at his master's breast. "Bayard," said he, looking at her over the horse's neck. "You ask my horse's name, but not mine?" "I would be fain to know your name, sir," she replied, and bent her head a little. "I am called Erland Nicolausson," said he. "Then, Erland Nicolausson, have thanks for your good service this night," said Kristin, and proffered him her hand. Of a sudden she flushed red, and half withdrew her hand from his. "Lady Askild Gautersdatter of Dovre? Is she your kinswoman?" she asked. To her wonder she saw that he too blushed. He dropped her hand suddenly and answered, "She is my mother's sister, and I am Erland Nicolausson of Huseby." He looked at her so strangely that she became still more abashed, but she mastered herself and said, "'Tis true, I should have thanked you with better words, Erland Nicolausson, but I know not what I can say to you." He bowed before her, and she felt that now she must bid him good-bye, though she would fain have spoken more with him. In the church door she turned, and as she saw that Erland still stood beside his horse, she waved her hand to him in farewell. The convent was in a hubbub, and all within in great dismay. Hakon had sent word home by a horseman, while he himself went seeking the maids in the town, and folks had been sent from the convent to help him. The nuns had heard the wild beast had killed and eaten up 2 children down in the town. This, to be sure, was a lie, and the leopard, there was only one, had been caught before vespers by some men from the king's palace. Kristin stood with bent head and kept silence, while the abbess and Sister Potentia poured out their wrath upon the 2 maidens. She felt as though something were asleep within her. Ingeborg wept and began to make excuse. They had gone out with Sister Potentia's leave with fitting attendance, and sure they were not to blame for what had happened after. But Lady Grower said they might now stay in the church till the hour of midnight struck, that they might strive to turn their thoughts to the things of the spirit, and might thank God who had saved their lives and honour. "God hath now manifested clearly to you the truth about the world," said she. "Wild beasts and the servants of the devil threaten his children there at every footstep, and there is no salvation except ye hold fast to him with prayer and supplication." She gave them each a lighted candle, and bade them go with Sister Cecilia Bardsdatter, who was often alone in the church praying the whole night long. Kristin put her candle upon St. Lawrence's altar and knelt on the praying stool. She fixed her gaze on the flame, while she said over the Paternoster and the Ave Maria softly. The sheen of the candle seemed little by little to enfold her, and to shut out all that was outside her and the light. She felt her heart open and overflow with thankfulness and praise and love of God and his gentle mother. They came so near to her. She had always known they saw her, but tonight she felt that it was so. She saw the world as in a vision, a great dark room whereinto fell a sunbeam. The motes were dancing in and out between the darkness and the light, and she felt that now she had at last slipped into the sunbeam. She felt she would gladly have stayed for ever in this dark, still church, with the few small spots of light like golden stars in the night, the sweet stale scent of incense, and the warm smell of the burning wax, and she at rest within her own star. It was as if some great joy were at an end, when Sister Cecilia came gliding to her and touched her shoulder. Bending before the altars, the 3 women went out of the little south door into the convent close. Ingeborg was so sleepy that she went to bed without a word. Kristin was glad. She had been loath to have her good thoughts broken in on, and she was glad, too, that they must keep on these shifts at night. Ingeborg was so fat, and had been so over-hot. She lay awake long, but the deep flood of sweetness that she had felt lifting her up as she knelt in the church would not come again. Yet she felt the warmth of it within her still. She thanked God with all her heart, and thought she felt her spirit strengthened while she prayed for her father and mother and sisters, and for Arne Gerdson's soul. Father, she thought. She longed so much for him, for all they had been to one another before Simon Dar came into their lives. There welled up in her a new tenderness for him. There was, as it were, a foretaste of mother's love and care in her love for her father this night. Dimly she felt that there was so much in life that he had missed. She called to mind the old black wooden church at Gøderud. She had seen there, this last Easter, the graves of her 3 little brothers, and of her grandmother, her father's own mother, Kristin Lavransdatter, who died when she brought him into the world. What could Erland Nicolausson have to do in Gøderud? She could not think. She had no knowledge that she had thought much of him that evening. But the whole time the thought of his dark, narrow face and his quiet voice had hung somewhere in the dusk outside the glow of light that enfolded her spirit. When she awoke the next morning, the sun was shining into the dormitory, and Ingeborg told her how Lady Grower herself had bidden the lay sisters not to wake them for matins. She had said that when they woke, they might go over to the kitchen house and get some food. Kristin grew warm with gladness at the abbess's kindness. It seemed as if the whole world had been good to her.